Hello, I'm Cameo George, executive producer of American Experience, PBS's flagship and longest running history series. Thank you for being here. Past Forward Conversations with American Experience is our monthly virtual conversation series where we discuss the enduring themes explored in our films with historians and experts. Today's Past Forward explores the intersection between studying and stealing culture. It is inspired in part by our new documentary, Zora Neale Hurston Claiming a Space, which is available to stream now on our website, americanexperience.org, and on the PBS video app. Zora Neale Hurston Claiming a Space is an in depth biography of the influential author whose groundbreaking anthropological work would challenge assumptions about race, gender, and cultural superiority that had long defined the field in the 19th century. In today's conversation, our guests will discuss the history of anthropology and culture, the power dynamics inherent in the study of marginalized cultures, and the line between appreciating and appropriating culture. As always, this is meant to be an interactive conversation. I invite you to write questions in the live chat. We'll answer as many as possible during the discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge our corporate sponsor, Liberty Mutual Insurance. I'd also like to acknowledge the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, members of the Better Angels Society, the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation, the Documentary Investment Group, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, PBS, our home station, GBH, and of course, viewers like you. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our panel for today's conversation. Dr. Jonathan Michael Square is the assistant professor at Parsons School of Design. The recipient of numerous fellowships and grants, Dr. Square's work considers histories of enslavement through the lens of fashion. Currently, he is working on a book manuscript titled Negro Cloth: How Slavery Birthed the Global Fashion Industry. Dr. Eve Dunbar is a professor of English at Vassar College. She's the author of Black Region of the Imagination, the co-editor of African American Literature in Transition 1930 to 1940, and various academic and public-facing essays. The conversation will be moderated by Dr. Adrienne Lentz Smith, an associate professor in Duke University's History Department, where she teaches courses on the Civil Rights Movement, Black Lives, Modern America, and history in fact and fiction. Thank you again, and please enjoy the conversation.
Thank you, Cameo, and welcome, Eve and Jonathan. I'm delighted to be here with you this afternoon to talk about the intersection between studying and stealing culture. I'm going to throw out, to start us off, some very big questions. We'll go from there. So to ask the big ones first, will you talk to us a little bit about what anthropology is? What is anthropology? How would you define culture? And then as well as cultural appropriation, and where do you see it play out in our lives? And I don't know, whichever one of you feels this can take that question first.
I can start off. I think of anthropology like many university disciplines starting in the 19th century. And it literally means the study of man. But I mean, what does that really mean? Like, we're all studying human beings on some level. The way I think about it is, as it was originally conceived, it was the study of othered peoples or marginalized communities. And this is a point that's actually made in the documentary, but it was also used as a justification for colonialism and slavery. I also think of anthropology as being a discipline, and in the wider sense of discipline, like, there's a set of um, there's a roadmap, a methodological roadmap. There's, strictures, there's conventions that you have to follow as a part of this discipline. And this is a point that was made in the film, but Zora Neale Hurston suffered because she sort of broke out of um, the strictures of the discipline of anthropology, and she was labeled as being unscientific. In reality, of course, she was on the forefront of anthropological practice. We recognize that now. I mean, but one thing I appreciated about the film is that we think of Zora Neale Hurston as being, this literary giant, but she was also a very important anthropologist. She is not always recognized for that.
So Eve, can I ask you the
Um,
what is culture question?
yeah, I think that that's a big question. I think culture is kind of, in some ways, impossible to define because it is the language, the music, the art, the general discourse, the mores of a group of people, right? And that group of people can be as small, when I think of culture, as a neighborhood has a culture, a town has a culture, a group of people who are confined to a particular space together have a culture. And we can scale that up to the nation state, right? That there is when we talk about the United States, we talk about American culture. And so I think thinking about it as this scalable measure for talking about community is really helpful to me. Um, and thinking about it as permeable, that cultures shift, that cultures are influenced by other communities, other cultures, influx, they export, they include all of these qualities that we might associate with a community or a group of people or a nation. But I think it's really key to think about it as not fixed. And I think that in sort of building off of what Jonathan was saying about anthropology, one of the issues, I think, especially with early anthropology, growing out of these really pseudoscientific methods, even travel logs, right? Colonial experts or colonial colonizers going into these new lands and attempting to assess the group of people. And I think all of those realities of that 19th century discipline development are about trying to cultivate an other through fixing an understanding of that their culture. And so I think for us here in the 21st century, a resistance to the fixing of culture, while at the same time understanding communities um, do share qualities that might be observable, but that those qualities are always in flux.
So this might be a good time to turn and watch a clip from the documentary, because I mean, what I hear you saying is that culture, to some extent, both emerges from and produces community and communities. And Zora Neale Hurston seemed to be working with an understanding of that more akin to yours than maybe to some of her co sort of sojourners in the field of anthropology. In the documentary, we see how Hurston redefines the field of anthropology as she studies Black culture and even makes a claim that Black culture is a dynamic thing. Part of what she was doing, or part of what was driving her, was a desire to reclaim and validate the experiences of Black America, or sort of Black folks throughout the diaspora, throughout the Americas, as having their own culture worthy of study that was independent of the kinds of hierarchical laden definitions or understandings of culture that you guys have already talked about. So let's turn to the film for a few minutes, and I'll come back and ask you some more questions.
Much of the impetus for culture anthropology ethnography was called salvage ethnography.
Salvage anthropology was the idea that one of the goals of the anthropologist was to rush in and collect things before they were all destroyed by modernity. On the one hand, this was a very noble pursuit, that you wanted to grab things before they disappeared. On the other hand, it could lead you to believe that you were visiting so-called primitive societies that existed in a permanent present, that they had no past, they had no future.
And that was believed by a lot of people. But Zora Neale Hurston understood that culture was not being replaced as much as it was emerging and on a continuum. And that was super sophisticated.
I am getting much more material than before because I am learning better technique. Am keeping close tab on expressions of double meaning, too. Also compiling lists of double words. They, to give emphasis, use the noun and put the function of the noun before it as an adjective. Example, sitting chair, suck bottle, cook pot, hair comb. I have about enough for a good volume of stories.
She may be our first Black female ethnographer, documentary filmmaker. She uses that expensive and rare film equipment to document the lives of ordinary, everyday Black children and Black women and Black communities, providing for us some of the earliest footage we have of the everyday visual lives of Black Southern Americans.
Hurston next traveled to New Orleans. With Mason's support for another year, she was able to rent a 3-room house. She devoted most of her time to fieldwork on a topic that she perceived white folklorists to be sensationalizing and misrepresenting: hoodoo and conjure, folk religion and practices created by enslaved African Americans.
Hurston's the daughter of a preacher, and I think that Hurston had a strong investment in the spiritual life of Black people and Black women in particular.
The closest that Boaz and his students had gotten to participant observation would be to sit in on a ritual or a religious practice and watch it and note down what happened. For Hurston, you had to jump off the high dive. If you were going to study hoodoo or voodoo, you had to do it from the inside. And so she went through at least 4 initiation rituals.
One hoodoo doctor asked her to chase down a black cat in the night, boil it in a cauldron, and suck on its bones. Another had her lie naked and fasting for 69 hours, experiencing strange and altered dreams. The ceremony ended with the painting of a red and yellow lightning bolt down her back.
That she succeeded is a testament to her resilience, her willingness to do whatever she had to do to get her work done.
I am getting on in the conjure splendidly. I have been going to every one I hear of for the sake of thoroughness. I am knee-deep in it, with a long way to go.
Okay, so let's try to, I don't know, wrap our heads around both some of the content, but then also some of the things that the content might get us thinking about. And let's go back to the topic of today's conversation, which is cultural appropriation. Jonathan, can I ask you to say a little bit about kind of what you understand cultural appropriation to be, but then also what's the relationship or the difference or the interaction between appreciation and appropriation?
Yeah, absolutely. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. um, yeah, I mean, appropriation literally means to take something and make it your own. And for me, there's three defining characteristics of cultural appropriation. One, there's a monetary or capitalistic element of it. So when you take something when a dominant culture in particular takes a cultural element from a less dominant culture and makes money off of it, that for me is appropriative. Another really important element of cultural appropriation is a stark power differential. So we're talking about more dominant cultures poaching or stealing or appropriating cultural elements from less dominant cultural groups. And for me, the third element of cultural appropriation is when you take something that has religious or spiritual or sacred significance and you sort of strip it of its meaning and you adopt it. So those, for me, those are the three elements of cultural appropriation.
Okay. Eve, do you understand it in a similar way? And then I also to kind of ask about the sort of broader conversation about cultural appropriation. And do you see it being used in in the way that I guess this part is for either one of you, in the ways that y'all understand it in mainstream conversation? I can't hear you.
I think of it similarly to Jonathan. And I would add, however, that I do think that there is a seepage between appreciation and appropriation. Um, in that, I think that historically, and I'm thinking about this through the lens of, let's say, Black culture and, you know, minstrelsy in particular, thinking about the ways in which, in terms of the power differential, white Americans historically have performed in blackface. And I think of it through kind of that book by Eric Lott, Love and Theft, right? So that there's a way in which there is a certain amount of envy that then gets kind of move through to become a kind of violent mimicry, right? And so I think of it, thinking about them kind of as working on a continuum is really useful to me, because I'm not sure if the dominant culture would appropriate whatever cultural artifact, cultural practice, had they not had some kind of initial interest. Maybe appreciation is the wrong word, but initial interest in the object, the thing, the practice that they're appropriating. So I would encourage us to maybe think about that as a continuum and see what what emerges from there. I think you had a second question. The second part of the question was for Jonathan.
Well, it's for either of you, but the sort of question of how do kind of popular discussions, I say mainstream, I think I really mean the internet, but like the way that folks talk about cultural appropriation, do you think that has amplified an awareness to it, flattened an understanding of cultural exchange and the sort of like intertwining of things, both and?
I would probably say both and but I do think everything hinges on that first quality that Jonathan kind of raised in terms of the capitalistic um, impetus, right? So there's a way in which I think appropriations of cultures by dominant cultures who figure out how to monetize these when other cultures have been unable to monetize them. One can think about the Kardashians, and this is the easy example of monetizing, making an empire off of features, qualities that African American women and African American culture has kind of valued historically that hadn't been valued by mainstream culture in terms of bodies, lips, sort of features. And they've managed to figure out how to turn that into millions upon millions. I don't know. What do you think, Jonathan?
Yeah, and just to add on to the conversation, and particularly what you said about the internet, which I think is really important because a lot of the modern conversations about cultural appropriation are happening on social media. Um, Cultural appropriation in some ways reminds me of like buzzwords like intersectionality or Afrofuturism. Sometimes the term gets thrown around without people actually studying the etymology or like the genealogy of these terms and where they come from. It just becomes a hot button word that sort of gets people riled up. And I have to be honest, sometimes I use cultural appropriation in that way because I think people listen in a different way when you use a word when you use a word like cultural appropriation. But I think you're right that the word it does lack nuance, and there's more complicated conversations that we can have about just to use your term cultural exchange. But I use it sometimes because people's ears immediately perk up, like they listen, they sort of get interested in what you're saying when you use a term like cultural appropriation. But if you actually use the complicated, messy terms to describe how people interact with each other and how cultures are actually exchanged, they might not be as interested.
And you write about fashion specifically, right? Where I imagine some people are talking about inspiration, and part of the counter is to ask them to think about where inspiration becomes just straight up taking. And so I'm wondering if you'll talk about how cultural appropriation, either how it works in fashion or the kinds of discussions that you see happening in and around fashion.
Yeah, I mean, this issue of appropriation, it happened well until very recently, very easily. I think it's the nature of visual and material culture. Until very recently, if someone saw something that they liked, they'd adopt it and start incorporating it into their wardrobes. And it isn't until recently that we started having conversations about power and representation and appropriation that now people are thinking more critically and being more thoughtful about their inspiration. And I think, this is a new conversation. I think it's probably only 2 decades old, really. Um, but I think just to bring the conversation to fashion, I think in the fashion world, there's always this search for the new, for whatever's novel, and people are always um, searching for something that's fashionable or trendy, and so they'll often look to the streets or to marginalized communities for inspiration, and they're not. But the thing is, they're not forthcoming about what their inspiration is, or they're not, as we would say, they're not citing their references, they're not showing their receipts, um, and it's a complicated issue because, and this is going back to something that Dr. Dunbar said in the beginning of the conversation, but we don't live in a vacuum. Like, cultures are pastiches of other cultures, and it's really easy to sort of cross that line from appreciation to appropriation. But I think now we're finally having nuanced conversations where we're able to sort of parse out when we cross that line.
I mean, it occurs to me that we're having two conversations simultaneously. One is about culture and how we talk about how we see culture in action, and then we sort of started with anthropologists and the discipline, as you say, Jonathan, right? Like sort of how they study it, how they think about it. Will you go back, Eve? I'm going to ask you to do this a little bit and talk a little bit more about how early anthropologists approach studying culture, and then amplify a little bit sort of we said in the intro to the clip that Hurston's approach was different. And so how do you see her approach as breaking with the kind of the discipline of anthropology as it was in that moment.
I think if we think about the late 19th, early 20th century, and the discipline into which Hurston is trained, which is Columbia's anthropology department, with France Boas as the head, right? And she's trained in participant observation, which is actually an innovation that is meant to make sure that folks aren't just sort of going to Fiji for a day and then writing full books on the culture, right? That the idea of participant observation is that you go to a site and enter into a community and spend time observing and participating in what's happening in that culture. Then you would come back and write those notes up, and that would begin your intervention, your disciplinary intervention. And so I think she's being taught that participant observation model. She's being sent to the American South as a Black observer, with the expectation that her Blackness would allow her more access to the community, which is ultimately true in her case. But even she, in her introduction to Mules and Men, writes about the failure of those methods for soliciting the kind of information that would be most beneficial to the discipline. And she has to take those strategies. And I think, as the clip that we watched illustrate, she has to sort of maneuver them and maneuver herself as something more than just an observer, but instead be a true participant. So when you see her innovating that participant observation, she's able to get at what I think she believes to be something more true, something more authentic about the communities that she's participating in. The community, in the case of Eatonville, that she grew up in and she returns to sort of bring that community to the discipline as viable and as interesting and worthy of study. So I think she takes the core elements of that innovation that someone like Boas is instructing, and then even kind of more succinctly retrofits it in order to do the work that I think she feels is actually more ethical and more important.
And I think the problem with university... Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I was going to say, I think the problem with university disciplines is that they were conceptualized as being practiced by white men. And so you had to adopt the tone of a dispassionate observer. And Zora Neale Hurston was not only a practitioner of this discipline, she was also a member of the communities that she studied. And that was not a disjuncture, but a tension, in that she was often labeled as being scientific because she refused to separate herself from the communities. And I think this is something that we all might grapple with as Black academics. Like, sometimes when I'm writing and I use, the third person plural to describe Black people, I'm like, I'm writing about Black people as if I'm not a Black person. It's like, how do you sort of, like, the word we'd use now is positionality, but there wasn't a language around that in the early 20th century.
This is the nice thing about being a historian, right? Because, like, I'm a Black person, but I'm not a 1920 Black person. So there's a way that the kind of, like, the understanding of the we-ness and the they-ness is, it is the lines, well, I was going to say the lines are clear, and then I pause because I don't know that they are, but they seem more clear when you start out in the work. But I also, to your point, I sort of love the thing in the documentary, or the moment when they talk about her going into Eatonville and asking, again, in this tone that she's learned in her studies, and people around her being like, what are you doing? why do you sound like that? What's wrong with you right now?
Right. She says she has to shake her Barnardese, right? Like that this is a foreign language that she's been taught to assess the culture through, and it doesn't kind of register to the community. And I think that that point of kind of how do you do justice to the people that you're interested in without alienating them and yourself, I think is a real issue for many Black academics, and absolutely an issue for Hurston that she ultimately overcomes through, you know, not necessarily being herself, but not separating herself from the communities that she goes into.
And it reminds me of
please.
Sorry. It reminds me of Du Bois's idea of double consciousness, sort of reconciling how you see yourself and how the world sees you. And I think in Zora Neale Hurston's undisciplined methodology, she sort of was able to work through that double consciousness. It's like, I'm going to be myself and I'm going to be fully present in the work that I'm doing, and I'm not going to separate myself from the communities that I am a part of.
And she's going to contain multitudes, but those multitudes include the pieces of her that emerge or kind of like articulate with those communities. So I feel like embedded in our conversation is a sense that cultural appropriation is bad, right? Or, bad for some communities or something. But I'd actually like y'all to sort of bring it out a little bit more. What kind of injuries and harm does cultural appropriation do to communities that have been historically marginalized or had less access to resources or power?
I want to kind of, maybe this is where the nuance that you spoke of earlier would be useful, because even in asking that question, I'm thinking a lot of extraction. And I think of, if we think of appropriation when it becomes extraction, cultural extraction. So the what is valuable in a community is kind of lifted out of that community for profit by a different community, and it's extracted, and there's no access then to that cultural artifact, that cultural stuff, whatever it is. That to me is the injury. And I think about, you can do it with most of Black culture and Native American culture, in particular in the US. But Black music is probably a prime example of cultural extraction, whereby you get white artists who are able to appropriate, extract what musical elements the culture seems to enjoy, and that I'm thinking the culture writ large as American culture, cultural consumers enjoy, and then turn that into a profit that Black artists would never have imagined. Someone like Elvis, we used to talk about Eminem, like these white artists who are able to extract the cultural elements, perform them in a way that's pleasing, and then turn profits that are extraordinary.
I also think that conversations around cultural appropriation can be a bit distracting, particularly the conversations that happen online. I think there can be very nuanced conversations about cultural appropriation, particularly as it being a symptom of systemic racism and structural inequality. But I think often as the conversation plays out online, people aren't really listening to each other. And so it ends up taking like marginalized communities who could be sort of fighting for a more equitable world, or sort of fighting to change like policies that negatively impact them, is sort of locked into this back and forth conversations with interlocutors that are not even opening to changing their minds or really listening to them.
I really like that. I just want to kind of piggyback on that point, and it makes me think of that quote from Toni Morrison, when she says, the problem with racism is that it's distracted. It's a kind of a tool of the establishment to distract whomever, Black people in Morrison's case, from their true work, right? For her work, which was to write beautiful, important novels. And so I think that, these conversations become distractions from the work that we're all sort of really here to do.
Yeah. So those comments make me think. I have so many things. One, we could have a whole Eminem conversation, and go back to the movie 8 Mile, because there are also questions of like which is the culture that defines, like, that has ownership over something. So maybe it's not fair to use 8 Mile as a stand-in for thinking about Eminem, because it's the story he gives us to think with him about. But like the fact that his we-ness with the rest of the rap community is that he goes to public school and lives on whatever side of 8 Mile, and Anthony Mackie's character is actually in private school. And in terms of like class scrappiness, and that we tend to, and we're doing it in part because of the Zora Neale Hurston conversation, but that we're sort of, the community that we're shorthanding through is Blackness, when if people contain multitudes, there are all kinds of parts of who they are that organize their own cultural production or their reception of others. And that's the pretext. That's me telling you the question I wasn't going to ask you. But I do think that that's interesting to think about. I think the thing I really wanted to ask, though, was one, a question about interlocutors in a different way, which is to say, what do you do? How do we think about the people who, in some ways, commodify or use their own knowledge of a culture, having existed within or being the bridge to ease or guide other people's extraction from that culture? Is that too generally said? Right? Like,
yeah,
I think that's a trickier thing to think about, but an interesting thing to think about.
Do you have someone in mind when you form that question?
Well, so the question came out of me being like, we wouldn't get Eminem without Dr. Dre, right? And the kind of like, and the ways in which Dr. Dre, one, taught people to go back to funk, young people who'd never listened to it before, but then also like created the circumstances in which hip hop, he did not create, that is not fair. But the pop popularization of hip hop to some extent, in the way that it becomes a big money thing for the music industry, is linked to the folks who figured out first how to make it a big money thing for themselves without necessarily bringing a whole body of people on, right? Be that Dr. Dre himself, that's not fair, but sort of those figures in general. I also have a question about it for Zora Neale Hurston, who I don't think you'd say is an interlocutor in that same way. She's not making Black culture commodified, but she certainly amps up a visibility of certain kinds of cultural practices that everyone wants to run in behind her and make hay of. So,
But I love your entry point to the question was hip hop. I've been thinking a lot about hip hop because it's the 50th year of hip hop existence, and it's become sort of a art form that was innovated by Black and brown people in the Bronx to like a global musical genre. And so I think it's a good sort of case study for thinking about questions of appropriation and power. And I don't have a response necessarily to the first part of your question, but I think it's important. And it's I like that you sort of entered the question through thinking about Eminem and Dr. Dre. But yeah, to think about Zora Neale Hurston, I think she's kind of the anti-Dr. Dre in some ways. for a number of reasons. But the reason I call her the anti-Dr. Dre is because I think she fought against sort of the commodification of blackness. So when the publishers wanted her to publish Barracoon and sort of strip out um, cultural elements to make it more readable, to make it more mainstream, she refused. And so she fought fiercely to sort of represent African American expressive culture in all its complexity and authenticity. Unlike someone who might be doing it for a check.
I think I think it's interesting to think of her as the anti-Dr. Dre. Absolutely. Dr. Dre is one of the richest men in hip hop. And we know Zora dies a pauper. Um, so, but this is not to say that she wasn't herself looking to be paid, right? She writes in the form that she writes because there's money to be made publishing with a mainstream publisher and making Black folk culture readable to a general reading public. She just was never able to kind of turn that into a sustainable profit over the course of her lifetime. That said, what I think also separates her from one of these interlocutors who simply kind of gives, and I think we're talking about white culture, mainstream culture, access to Blackness for profit, for simple profit, is that I think her rationale for the work was to set a record straight, right? So when we get a text like Tell My Horse, which she goes into Jamaica and Haiti, in particular Haiti, she says, in order to counter the sensationalism that is afoot in the 30s regarding voodoo. Um, and so she's like, I'm the only Black person trained to go and do this, and I'm going to do it in such a way that it's going to undermine all of these zombie movies that are coming out, the Seabrook's zombie book, like that. She has the goal of rectifying the sensationalism of, in this case, voodoo culture. And I think that is not the case in a number of interlocutors, right? Which is not to say she's also not interested in financial gain, but she also has this other interest, which is in shifting understanding and knowledge production.
So we have loads of fantastic questions, and maybe I'll ask, like, sort of out of sequence, this one because I think it follows up, where an audience member asks, does the monetization of borrowed cultural expression automatically define appropriation? Or can cultural appropriation happen without making a profit?
Hmm. I would say that it's an important element, so that monetary element, but I think there's other important elements of appropriation. The example that I think of is I remember I had a friend who was really upset about these memes that were making around on social media of Japanese teenagers sort of replicating curly, kinky hair. And, I'm not encouraging Japanese teenagers to try to replicate black hair, but it didn't anger me because, they weren't making money off of it. They were just playing around with their own hair and sort of, I'm not saying it's okay, but I think in like the scale of like my anger, it was pretty low. However, if someone who wasn't black was making money off of replicating black hair and sort of benefiting from the thing that we're often ostracized for or ridiculed for, then I would have a problem about it. So I think for me that the money component is really important, but I think it's complicated. I think I have to look at it a case by case basis.
You had
I think
also
this
those other two shades in your original sort of discussion of appropriation, which included sort of divesting the sacred of its sacrality, And then also power, right? And differentials in power. So that seems. Eve, I'm sorry.
I was only going to add this sort of where we began the conversation, the relationship between appreciation and appropriation, sort of the nature of that appreciation that Japanese young people have for curly hair is something we can talk about. Whether or not it rises to the level of appropriation, I agree. I don't, it would not sort of, it doesn't feel like appropriation per se. It it seems to be rooted in appreciation, but I don't know if appreciation is without negative connotation either, right? That one appreciates the alien. Um, why would be a question I would ask those young people. Why? What is it about this hair? Is it because it's so different from yours? What's the nature of that difference? How do you feel? You know, where are the power dynamics in that? So I think it begs for more conversation rather than, to go back to an earlier point, once something gets labeled appropriation, somehow it's kind of, the conversation is moot and dulled. We don't need to have it. But I think all of these, obviously, we've been sitting here talking, the nature of appropriation is complex and deserves conversation.
So while we're on the subject of young people, I'm going to ask this question. What do we think about Halloween costumes for children? How do we help children have respectful interest in and engagement with other cultures? Rule 1, no blackface.
Right. I feel like that's like, or yellow face, or, you know, brown face or red face. You know,
no putting stuff in your face to be a different color. Yeah.
Yeah, just keep your face. And that to me seems like a general rule. And to go back to that third quality of the sacred, right? If this is obviously something sacred to a group of people, you probably shouldn't put on a headdress. You don't need to kind of engage with sacred elements of people's culture. And if you don't know what's sacred, you probably don't need to be dressing in that costume anyway. So I don't know.
Yeah, I would just add on. I would just add on that, you know, you can appreciate something without sort of adapting it or putting it on your body. So I mean, visit an object at a museum, or like look at photos of it on the internet, but you don't have to wear it literally.
I was going to say that should be a tattoo, but I guess that's putting it on your body. So maybe I'm missing. This person asks, how important is crediting the originator or creator of a cultural contribution? Does credit, citing your sources, ameliorate appropriation?
I would say so. I think whenever you can, and just to use like academic terms, like cite your sources, say what your inspiration is, you know, show the footnotes, give us the receipts. And I think that's one way. It's not the only thing you should do. So it doesn't free you of like accusations of cultural appropriation by saying that you're inspired by X, Y, or Z. But I think the more transparency, the better.
Can I kind of throw this question out as a question to you all? Because I'm thinking about this in terms of, for some reason I'm on music today, the Rolling Stones, who were very good at citing the kind of Black music that they sourced their popular music from. I'm not sure if that necessarily was enough, right, for those early musicians who weren't able to reap the benefits of that citation. And so, yeah, I would throw it out to you guys just in terms of conversation. At what point does one, and to go back to profit, who receives great profit from that appropriation or that extraction, what do you owe beyond citation to a group of people? and I think about this in fashion too. You know, if I go to the streets and I see, you know, this really cool thing that all the kids are doing, and I then add it to my spring collection, and I'm making tons of money. I don't know if this actually happens, but I'm going to sell these pieces for a ton of money to really wealthy people. Like, is that sourcing, saying, oh, I went to the streets and I found this group of kids in the Bronx who were really neat, and I incorporated that style into my spring collection. Is that enough?
I would say no. I mean, it's an important first step, and if you're open about it, then it sort of um, allows people to sort of demand that you contribute back to the communities that you're inspired by. Um, I consulted on a project for a designer who was inspired by Gee's Bend, which is a rural quilting community in Alabama, and he was very open about being inspired by these black women who were very important quilters who have been cited for years, have been on many people's mood boards for decades, but don't necessarily get named. And so what I really liked about the project is that he shared the profits from their collaboration with them, and they collaborated with every aspect of the project, from quilting the panels that were used for the fashion items, casting the photo shoot, designing the logo, naming the collaboration. And I think for me, that's a model for how designers should ethically collaborate with marginalized communities. So like have them as thought partners throughout every aspect of the collaboration.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And I mean, and if we use the sort of Stones example again, to say, who do they take on tour with them, right? And who do they, and it in some cases, the blues musicians who inspired them might not have still been alive or around, but maybe they were, or maybe the next generation who was also inspired. So that dynamism of that tradition, but then also even within the world of rock and roll, who, again, funk bands or soul bands or folks who were heirs in popular music, did they create a platform for them to also be known? I think the answer, having just listened to the audio book of Questlove's Music and His History, is in some instances, yeah, that they didn't stop interacting with the music. They didn't just use it as a jumping off point. And I still don't know that that's adequate, but I think that it is, in the world of low bars, better than some,
As my student said last semester, the bar is in hell. So when your bar is that low, anything becomes enough, right? If the bar is in hell.
In which level of the inferno is it?
No, the 12. Yeah.
So I actually love this question. What's the most egregious example of cultural appropriation you can think of?
Oh my gosh. Wow. I mean, this is low-hanging fruit, but many of the things that the Kardashians have done, whether it's taking sort of a ratchet aesthetic that someone like Black China became famous for, sort of making it a little more palatable, using air quotes here, and selling it to the masses, to, selling Tupac and Biggie t-shirts. They're like the masters of appropriation.
I'm going to have to agree. I think that they have turned it into an art form. And to sort of go back to our discussion of social media, the number of small lawsuits that they have encountered in their kind of appropriation of small scale designers from whom they will buy an object, and then you'll see said object in their lines of whatever they're making, kind of that lack of citation, but that egregious abuse of cultural dominance, I think, is afoot in all of the sort of their workings.
I'm going to agree with you and not come up with my own example because I think it's hard to, at least in this moment, in this age, that's a pretty strong one. I also don't like DJs who use names that they think will sound black so that they get a sort of broader audience in that way. Because then you're not even owning up to your appropriation. For our final question, I will ask this one, which we've been talking about kind of, pop culture or what have you, but someone in the audience asks, how does cultural appropriation play out in the arts, broadly speaking?
I'm going to assume that they mean the visual arts, maybe. Or I'm going to answer with an example from the visual arts. But I think about artists like Brancusi or Picasso or Man Ray, who are very much looking at African and Afro-diasporic art and created artworks that were inspired by Black art and never really cited the fact that they were sort of directly inspired by African art. It's only the work of art historians in the last few decades who sort of uncovered their inspirations through archival research. And so, it plays out in most forms of visual and material culture. And it's only till recently that through the work of scholars like us, that people are finally having these conversations.
I agree. I think that I think about this in terms of narrative, right? As a literary scholar, the use of culture, cultural voices, cultural stories, folklore, if you will, from marginalized communities to weave into when white authors weave these stories into their own tales, and reap benefits of acclaim, not necessarily just financial benefits, but I think the benefit of acclaim. Um, it happens so frequently, but on the other hand, one doesn't want to get into the business necessarily of doing that kind of work of saying culture is encased in amber and there's no kind of capacity for it to move or circulate. So I think it's just a really um, delicate work that artists have to embark upon when they are inspired by or influenced by the works of people who happen to be in communities that aren't their own, and doing justice again and ethically engaging and acknowledging that engagement.
I would say if there are any like artists or makers watching this conversation, I think it's important just to talk about it. If you have any questions, um, talk to a friend, do a Twitter poll, use IG stories, have a conversation about it instead of just doing it.
And don't assume that your love is not theft. Just work hard at reflection. Thank you both so much for this, and thank all of y'all out there in internet world for joining the conversation. I'm going to bring us to a close by passing it back to Cameo for closing remarks.
Thank you for joining us today for this conversation exploring the intersection between studying and stealing culture. Zora Neale Hurston, Claiming a Space, is now available to stream in full on our website, americanexperience.org, and in the PBS video app. You can watch our past forward conversations anytime on our YouTube channel or on our website. And if you liked what you saw today, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for our events newsletter. You'll be the first to know about new conversations, opportunities to watch films with us live, and more. Thank you for joining us.